Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to what is going to be my wrap-up for June and a TBR for July. Been away again with my mother because of her health issues over the last week or so I haven't made a lot of videos, haven't watched a whole lot of videos, but I did finish up my reading for June, so I thought I would make a video about that. I think some of these books I've already talked about. I'm relatively sure I've talked about several of them. The first of those would be The Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki, which I really started reading at the end of May, finished up I think in the first week of June, and I liked it. I thought it was a good book. I thought it was well done. I think I mentioned that I was far more interested in the storyline involving the young man's mother than in the storyline involving the main character, which, you know, felt a little bit youthful for me to be interested in, you know, first loves, problems at school, those kind of things. While I can appreciate them and appreciate everything Ozeki did in the book, you know, I don't necessarily think it's a book that I would probably run to pick up that kind of book again. The second book I read, and I'm almost positive I talked about, was Blackouts by Torres. This was the winner of the National Book Award, and it essentially centers on the lives of two gay men who are friends, even though I don't believe they've actually been in a romantic or sexual relationship with one another, who end up spending a lot of time in a place which feels like almost like a hospital or like a nursing home together as the older one of those men dies, I presume dies of AIDS, and they kind of tell one another stories about their romantic history, about their coming out, about family reactions, and interspersed between the stories they tell one another, there are pieces of text taken from an actual work, purporting to provide some real analysis of homosexuality produced by authors in the United States, and rather than being an honest or even sympathetic or compassionate discussion of that, that text was exploitative. And so what Torres has done is he's taken those pages and he's blacked out parts, so the story that they tell is different than the story that they originally told. Additionally, there are photographs and other images which I just thought really accentuated and made the story really good. And if you're looking for kind of what it is, I would say it's kind of a look at the history of the treatment of gay men in the United States of America from, let's say, I don't know, the mid-40s, 50s, up through the AIDS epidemic, which killed so many people and which was largely ignored by the United States. At least it was until it moved into the heterosexual community. And therefore it's a story of kind of mistreatment, of negligence, of hatred, of, you know, those kind of things. I thought it was really powerful, a really good book. Similarly, I read right after that, this is also, both of these, that book and the next two are part of my Pride reading for June. The second book I read for Pride was The New Life by Tom Crewe. This is a book set at the end of the 19th century, which really kind of it deals with two real men who really did write about homosexuality during that time period, and who are real historic figures. Now, it doesn't tell their story directly, it moves their story forward in time, it creates different scenarios around their lives and around what they publish and those kind of things, but the idea was they were going to, you know, write a book which they thought would prove to people who read it that homosexuality was, you know, not psychosis, that it was not deviancy, that it was a natural part of life for lots of human beings and naturally occurring, and they believed this would then bring about greater sympathy and reform, particularly in a law, the very law that sent Oscar Wilde to prison. And the reason the story of what these two men did is move forward in time is so it can coincide with the trial of Oscar Wilde and his imprisonment. And, you know, it's fine. I thought The New Life was fine. I thought the relationships the characters created were fine. But and maybe it's because I read it after I read Blackouts by Torres. I thought, you know, and my friend Mark Nash pointed out to me in a comment, that these two books tell a very similar story. Not, you know, different characters, different time period. And of the two, the story that's told better, I think, was Blackout. So to me, I think The New Life suffered a little bit by comparison. And it also just felt like something that was kind of pieced together from images, ideas from other places. To me, there was a little bit of Morris by E.M. Forster in there, as well as some other works. And so I wasn't as impressed with it. That doesn't mean it wasn't good. The third book I read for Pride was Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo. This is a YA novel set in San Francisco when a young woman of Chinese descent growing up in Chinatown begins to realize that she is in fact a lesbian, and her first relationship, first loves, and then on top of that there's also this overlaying idea of McCarthyism and the Red Scare and how that affected members of the Chinese American community regardless of whether they were born, whether they served in the military during World War II. And so what you really see, and what I think Lo does really well, is bring together a lot of or two stories which really prove that the United States, far from being the tolerant nation it'd like to believe it was, far from being a champion of human rights that I'd like to think it was, particularly after World War II, was actually oppressing, suppressing, terrorizing different groups of people. The Telegraph Club in the title refers to a club which was essentially a lesbian bar, a fictitious one I believe, in San Francisco, where our main character meets the young woman who becomes kind of her first love. And they're, one of the things I think is really done well, that Lo really does well there, is kind of layering all the different ways in which being a lesbian or lesbians express themselves physically, in their dress, in their attitude, in the way they carried themselves, in the relationships they entered into, in their attempts to protect and nurture one another. I thought all that was done really well. Having said that, it is a YA book, and it is a YA book about first loves and school problems and bullying and dealing with teenage friends. And so, in some ways, just as true with the Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki, there are some parts that just felt, like they weren't written for me, and indeed they weren't, because this was clearly a YA book. In addition to that, I also was continuing my Reading Bad Hemingway reading project, so I read Across the River and Into the Trees. I did a review for that. I'll try to remember to leave a link at the end. And what the conclusion I came to is that this really is a bad Hemingway novel, and probably only one you want to read if you're more interested in Hemingway the man and how his life, the deterioration of his life, affected his writing than in the story or the writing itself. I read Normal People by Sally Rooney. I read this with Mark Nash, who has a new book coming out with a title similar. I didn't read Normal People. I read Conversation with Friends, there we go, by Sally Rooney with Mark Nash, who felt like he should read it because he's working on a new book with a similar title. And so he and I, Buddy, read the book, and neither of us enjoyed it. This doesn't surprise me. I read Normal People, and while I can, I think, appreciate that story and maybe why it might mean something to generations younger than me and speak to them in a way it doesn't speak to me, with Conversations with Friends, I really didn't see how anybody could read this book and think this said something brilliant about a generation of people in any way. I thought there were issues with the writing. It seems like every once in a while Rooney just feels like she has to create an image. Sometimes those work, sometimes those don't. I thought in some ways influences on Rooney showed up, ironically, Hemingway, and the relatively terse way in which he writes. And then the characters were just really unlikable. Now, before you start to think that I don't know what I'm doing here, I accept that books can have unlikable characters, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with a book with unlikable characters, even if it's all of them. My problem was I got the feeling that we were supposed to like, or at least empathize with some of the characters, and I did not. Perhaps this is a generational thing. Maybe I need to make another one of those videos where I talk about being too old for certain books. But these people were just, I thought, and kind of borrowing from what Mark will probably say, just kind of caricatures and negative caricatures of young people from the generation. I couldn't see how that would possibly be, in any way affirming to young people who read it, and yet Rooney's was really popular with young people. I think, I thought that the book worked better if it was satire. She was satirizing the ideas that people have about younger generations, millennials. Then I thought the book would be brilliant, because as a satire, I think it works. As a straightforward novel, which we're supposed to identify with the characters and what they're going through, I couldn't see it at all. And then the last book I read was probably one of my favorite books, made one of my favorite books of the year, and that was Thunderclap by Thunderclap, A Memoir of Art and Life and Sudden Death by Laura Cumming. This is the only book that was nominated for the Women's Prize for Nonfiction. By the way, this year is the first year in which there's been a Women's Prize for Nonfiction. This is the only book from that list that I've read. I do intend to read others, but this is the one that definitely appealed to me the most. So it says it's a memoir of art, life, and sudden death, and the sudden death part has to do with the explosion of a gunpowder storehouse in the Dutch city of Delft, which blew up and killed a number of people, and among them the Dutch artist Karel Fabricius. Fabricius died when his house was blown down. Members of his family died. The people who were painting died, and so his art career kind of came to a close. And our author here is really, I want to say obsessed, but really kind of identifies with Fabricius the artist in a way that I think kind of contributes to the idea of the memoir. Cumming's father was an artist. And I think Cumming is making, in her mind, or in the book, not her mind, in her book, she's creating this parallel between her father, who died, younger than he should have, of something preventable, and, Fabricius, who died relatively quickly. I think there's definitely a connection there. And that makes the book personal and powerful. The author was an arts editor, arts reviewer, contributor, something like that at London newspapers, as well as, I believe, also literary publications. And so long background in writing and editing, and a long background in looking at and evaluating art. And so on the one hand, it is that memoir of art, life, and sudden death. And on the other hand, it is, I think, an incredibly valuable introduction to Dutch art and what it is and isn't. And one of the things I thought worked best for me here was that Cumming kind of talks about how oftentimes Dutch art gets explained as the fact that Dutch really like to have pictures of the things they owned. And so it makes the paintings seem, kind of pointless, like they don't have any deeper meaning, like they're strictly representational because, wealthy Dutch people wanted to see the items wealthy Dutch people owned. And they wanted to see themselves wearing the clothes they owned. They wanted to see the cities they had built. And certainly, she doesn't take anything away from the idea that the Dutch, the people in the Netherlands, were in the mid-17th century immensely proud of their country. They'd won their independence from Spain. They had fought. They were expanding economically, and there was a lot of pride there. But she makes a great point that there's far more to Dutch art, from Rembrandt through Vermeer, than just those things. That there's a lot more going on in those paintings than you might think. And so what really you also get alongside this kind of memoir and her reaction to art, and the story of Fabricius, and the story of her father, and her own story, in addition to that, you get kind of a brief glimpse at lots of important Dutch artists, from Rembrandt, as I said, through Vermeer, some of whom you may have known the names of, like I believe Frans Hals is in here, as well as some others whose name I won't attempt to pronounce. But what they contributed, and why their work was unique, and why it was more than just somebody painting a bunch of rich people in their rich clothes. And I thought that was really, really good because, to be honest with you, I had largely thought about Dutch art of these people as exactly that, with the exception of Vermeer. Now, Fabricius is most famous for painting the Goldfinch, which was, the object of art at the center of Donna Tartt's novel, The Goldfinch. And when you learn about the Goldfinch and its artists and those kind of things, then the story of the Goldfinch that Tartt tells, I think, actually seems more powerful and more relevant. But Fabricius, I think, only has 13 or 14 paintings that survived. I have no idea how many. We have no idea how many he created, how many might still be discovered. But it's a relatively small kind of body of work, and I think Cumming argues here that Fabricius was, a great artist, and he was doing things that even art critics of the 20th and early 21st century may not exactly understand. And certainly his works meant a lot to her, and I think that's because she makes this connection between Fabricius and her own father, both in physical appearance and perhaps in the way in which they approached art. So that's what I read. By the way, as I'm sure many of you know, another incredibly wonderful booktuber died last week. Alice from Alice and the Giant Bookshelf died, and she was a champion of the Women's Prize, part of the Women's Prize plot along, and therefore she was a champion of the Women's Prize for Nonfiction. And I went back and looked to see if she rendered an opinion about Thunderclap, And she had, it was at the time she made the video where she was predicting the books that would make the short list for the Women's Prize for nonfiction. This was one of the two she read, and she really liked it. And so I again felt that connection. Alice and I were not close. I didn't interact with her directly, but very often, every time I did, she was just a warm and wonderful person, and she will definitely be missed here on BookTube. So then on to my July TBR. You may know that sometime in April or May, maybe it was March, I appeared on the Fantasy Network hosted by Jimmy Nuts, and I did a live over there. It was like 2 hours long. I'll try to leave a link to that in the show notes down below. And I had a great conversation with Jimmy, and in the course of that, what came out was that I don't read a lot of science fiction. I don't read a lot of fantasy, which, Jimmy reads widely, but a lot of stuff on this channel focuses on those things. And so I kind of jokingly promised that I would do a Jimmy Stack July, would be my TBR, that I would read fantasy science fiction works, just to kind of catch up on some things that I'd been missing in terms of fantasy and science fiction, which are not two genres I read very often. So my TBR really reflects that. So in my Jimmy Stack July TBR, I am going to read Game of Thrones. I think I'm probably the only person in the English-speaking world who hasn't read it, but I'm going to read Game of Thrones. I already started listening to Rocannon's World by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is the first book, I believe, in her Hainish cycle. I believe we talked about reading Le Guin, even though I think I was supposed to read the Earthsea trilogy, and I went with the Hainish cycle because it was easy for me to find through the Libby app. So Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. I'm also going to read Sailing to Sarantium. There we go. Sailing to Sarantium by Guy Gavriel. Jimmy's a big fan of Gavriel K's work, and so I'm planning on reading that. And then also one of the books that we agreed on was on Black Tiger, Red Wolf by Marlon James, the first in a planned series of kind of high fantasy books, a trilogy based on African folk tales and mythology. And I liked Black Leopard, Red Wolf. I have not read the second book, which is Moon Witch, Spider King, but that's the other book I put on my list for Jimmy Stack July. So that's 4 or 5 books in my Jimmy Stack. One of the reasons why I want to kind of limit my TBR for July is I'll be traveling this month, family obligations this month, so I'm going to limit there. And I'm going to continue with my Reading Bad Hemingway series by reading Islands in the Stream. I believe this is the first posthumously published novel by Hemingway, and one which I have positive memories of, at least the first section. Again, I'll be reading that. Jack the Rambling Raconteur and I are kind of going to buddy read that together, and so I'll be picking it up and reading it sometime this month. Anyway, there you go. There is my June wrap-up and my July TBR. If you've read any of these books or have any thoughts about anything I said here, please leave your comments in the comment section down below, and as always, thank you for watching.